For more than 2 centuries, the Achaemenid Empire had ruled over one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. From the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of Central Asia, kings ruled from marble palaces, armies marched beneath golden standards, and royal blood was protected by layers of soldiers, servants, tradition, and fear. Inside the walls of Persepolis, life followed a rhythm few outsiders would ever understand. Silk moved across polished stone. Perfume drifted through open courtyards. Gold reflected torchlight across carved pillars. And behind walls few men were ever permitted to cross. The daughters of Persia lived in a world built on certainty. They were not simply daughters. They were alliances. They were future queens. They were political promises waiting to be fulfilled. Every marriage could change borders. Every child could secure dynasties. Every conversation inside the royal chambers could alter the future of empires. For generations, that world had seemed untouchable. Then the reports began. A young Macedonian king. Victories in Asia Minor. Cities surrendering faster than anyone expected. Satraps changing loyalty. Generals disappearing. Treasuries falling. At first, the palace dismissed the rumors. Empires do not fall because of one ambitious king. Empires survive ambition, or so they believed. But then came Issus. Then came Gaugamela. And suddenly, the impossible no longer felt impossible. Inside the palace, servants whispered. Nobles stopped making eye contact. Messengers arrived at unusual hours. And for the first time in generations, the daughters of Persia heard something they had never heard before. Fear. Not in the streets. Not among soldiers. Inside the palace itself. And when fear reaches the royal chambers, empires are already dying. For generations, the women of the Persian court had been taught one truth. The empire protects its blood. Kings may die. Generals may fail. Cities may burn. But royal blood must survive. Inside the halls of Persepolis, this belief had shaped every part of life. The daughters of Persia were raised with tutors, guarded by elite soldiers, and surrounded by servants whose loyalty had been tested for decades. They lived behind walls no enemy had ever crossed. Until now, the reports were no longer rumors. Alexander the Great was no longer a distant name whispered by merchants and frightened governors. He was coming, and unlike previous invaders, he was not slowing down. The victories at Issus and Gaugamela had shattered more than armies. They had shattered certainty. Entire satrapies were changing allegiance before a single Macedonian soldier appeared on their roads. Governors who once swore loyalty to the Persian crown now sent gifts, gold, and messages to the advancing conqueror. Some hoped to survive. Others simply understood something the palace had refused to accept. The empire was already falling. Inside the royal quarters, movement replaced routine. Scrolls disappeared. Treasury inventories were burned. Jewelry was removed from ceremonial chambers. Servants stopped unpacking garments. Rooms once prepared for festivals were suddenly being prepared for departure. No one said the word. No one said, escape. Because in an empire like Persia, kings do not flee. and royal daughters do not run. But that night they did. Under moonlight, covered wagons moved quietly through rear gates few outside the royal household even knew existed. Elite cavalry escorted them through mountain roads, avoiding main trade routes. No banners, no music, no ceremony, only silence and fear. Some of the young women believed this was temporary, a relocation, a precaution, a short journey before the empire regrouped. But older women inside the caravan understood something far worse. They were not leaving Persepolis. They were leaving the world they had always known, and many would never see it again. Behind them, the torches of the palace still burned. Ahead of them, nothing was certain. And somewhere beyond the mountains, Alexander kept moving. 4 days, the caravans moved without stopping, across mountain roads, through dry valleys, past villages that no longer raised Persian banners. At first, the escorts still believed they were ahead of the danger. The daughters of the Achaemenid Empire were still protected, still moving, still unseen. But empires do not collapse only when armies are defeated. They collapse when information changes sides. And by now, information was everywhere. Every merchant, every shepherd, every village elder, every frightened governor, everyone knew one thing: Alexander the Great was winning. And when one side keeps winning, people stop protecting the losing side. Routes once considered safe became visible. Local guides disappeared during the night. Horses were found missing by sunrise. Food shipments arrived late, or not at all. And slowly, the realization began to spread through the convoy. They were no longer traveling through their empire. They were traveling through the ruins of it. The first direct encounter came near a narrow mountain crossing. Not a battle, not an ambush. A decision. The local garrison, Persian soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to the crown, stood waiting at the pass. For a moment, the women inside the caravan believed rescue had arrived. Then the gates opened, and the soldiers stepped aside. Not for them, for the Macedonians. There was no dramatic charge. No desperate final defense, no heroic last stand, only silence and surrender. Some of the royal guards drew their weapons. They died quickly. Others understood immediately. Resistance was over. The daughters of Persia were ordered from the wagons one by one. Gold veils, silk garments, royal symbols. Everything that once separated them from ordinary people now made them easier to identify, and easier to value. For the young princesses, the most terrifying part was not the soldiers. It was what came next, because Alexander's officers did not treat them like prisoners. They treated them like assets. Political assets, dynastic assets, symbols, living pieces of an empire that had not yet fully disappeared. And that meant one thing: they were not being killed. They were being preserved, which, in many ways, was worse. By the time the daughters of the Achaemenid Empire were brought into the Macedonian camp, they already understood one truth: their old lives were over. The golden halls of Persepolis were now behind them. The silk, the servants, the rituals, the certainty, gone. But what they did not understand was why they were still alive. In every empire, royal blood carried value. But in moments of conquest, value can become something far more dangerous than survival. It becomes leverage. And no one understood leverage better than Alexander the Great. When the women were brought before his officers, they expected humiliation, judgment, possibly execution. Instead, they were given space, food, medical treatment, fresh clothing. At first, this felt impossible, almost merciful. But mercy was not what they were witnessing. They were witnessing strategy. Alexander did not need to destroy Persia's royal blood. He needed to control it, because a dead dynasty creates martyrs. A living dynasty creates obedience. News traveled quickly. Persian nobles hiding in mountain fortresses began hearing impossible stories. The Macedonian king had not slaughtered the royal women. He had protected them. He had preserved them. And suddenly, surrender no longer felt like betrayal. It felt practical. This was not kindness. It was psychological warfare. Inside the Macedonian camps, the daughters of Persia were now living inside a system that studied them, observed them, and quietly reshaped their future. Their movements were monitored. Their conversations were noticed. Their old servants were replaced. Their jewelry disappeared. Their language was no longer the only language spoken around them. Nothing violent. Nothing obvious, and that made it more effective, because conquest does not always happen with fire. Sometimes it happens through routine, through dependency, through adaptation, through survival. Weeks became months, and slowly some of the young women began doing the one thing they never imagined possible. They stopped asking when they were going home, because somewhere deep inside, they had already begun to understand. Home no longer existed. History often tells us that empires fall in battle, that kings die, cities burn, palaces collapse, and dynasties disappear. But the fall of the Achaemenid Empire was different, because Persia's royal blood did not vanish. It adapted, and that adaptation would change history in ways few people realize. Over time, the daughters of Persia stopped being seen as prisoners. They became symbols. Some were married into new power structures. Some became part of political alliances that connected Macedonian generals to Persian nobility. Some disappeared into court life so completely that later records no longer describe them as captives at all, only as wives, mothers, queens. And this was perhaps the most disturbing part of all, because history often celebrates conquest. But it rarely explains how conquest survives. It survives through blood, through names, through children, through marriages, through identities rewritten so gradually that future generations stop asking where those identities began. Even Alexander himself understood this. As his empire expanded, he no longer dressed only like a Macedonian king. He began adopting Persian customs, Persian clothing, Persian ceremony, Persian symbols. Many of his own officers hated it. Some feared he was changing. But Alexander understood something larger. If he wanted to rule Persia, he could not simply destroy it. He had to become part of it. And the daughters of Persia were part of that process. Years later, some of their children would grow up speaking multiple languages, carrying both Macedonian ambition and Persian blood. They would belong fully to neither world, and completely to both. So when people ask what happened to Persia's royal daughters after the empire fell, the answer is not that they disappeared. The answer is far more unsettling. They survived, and in surviving, they helped build the very empire that destroyed their own.